All right, now let's look at one way we can measure a nation's macroeconomic activity. We're going to use the production approach to add up gross domestic product. What is gross domestic product? That's the total market value of final goods and services produced within an economy in a given year. Now, all these parts of the definition are very important. We look at the total market value because this allows us to add up different goods and services by looking at their dollar value. We look at only final goods and services to avoid double counting of intermediate goods. If we counted a tire when it was purchased to put on a new car, then also counted it when it was purchased as part of the car, we would count that tire twice. So instead, we only count final goods and services. In that example, we would only count the tire when it was part of the purchase of the car. And so we look at all the market value of all final goods and services within an economy in a given year. That tells us how much is being produced in the economy that year. It gives us some idea of how much labor is being hired, how much capital is being used, how efficiently the economy is working when we look at gross domestic product over time. Now, we wanted to be able to differentiate between two different measures of GDP, where real GDP is a measure of GDP that controls for changes in prices. This is GDP that does not go up when prices go up. It only goes up when production goes up. Nominal GDP is the value of GDP in current dollars. Nominal GDP can rise for two reasons. One, prices could rise, so the price of everything we were producing goes up, nominal GDP would rise. If we had output, actually production of goods and services going up, nominal GDP would rise as well. So since we look at GDP as trying to figure out how much we're producing, a better measure of that is real GDP, because that only rises if output rises. And when we look at economic growth, this is increases in real GDP in an economy over long periods of time. This is a graph of U.S. real GDP from 1930 to 2011. And we can see that it generally has gone up over the last 80 years. And in fact, we could draw a line through it and try to get as close as possible, a smooth line going up. And it's not a perfect line, but you can see that generally real GDP has risen. And now when we look at long-run macroeconomic questions, which we're going to do later in the book, it's going to be questions about what makes this line go up over long periods of time. When we look at short-run macroeconomic questions, it's going to be questions about the business cycle, recessions and expansions. And so we would look at the Great Depression, and we look at the boom in the 1990s or the recession in 2007, and try and explain why actual output rises and falls above what we might call potential output, which we'll learn what that means later on. So we have two types of questions in macroeconomics. Long-run macroeconomic questions would talk about how come GDP rises and how fast it rises over long periods, and short-run macroeconomic questions, which talk about the business cycle. Now, when we add up GDP using the production approach, we're going to look at what types of goods are being produced, and we're going to separate them into four different components. The different components of GDP depend on who is buying it. So we have consumption expenditures, which are purchased by consumers. We have private investment expenditures, which are purchased by firms, and we're going to see that this is made up of different categories of investment expenditures, but one of the most important one is plants and equipment, which is the capital stock, which increases the productive capacity of the economy. We have government purchases by federal, state, and local governments, and we have net exports, which are the net purchases by the foreign sector, or domestic exports minus domestic imports. All goods and services which are produced are either consumption, private investment expenditures, government purchases, or net exports. So if we add all those up, we have a total of how much is being produced, called gross domestic product. Give you some idea of what we're talking about in terms of dollars. If we look at the third quarter of 2011 and we annualize these, what is U.S. GDP? Well, it was $15 trillion, or 15,000 billion dollars. 10 trillion, or almost 11 trillion of it, was made up of consumption expenditures. So the vast majority of what we produce in the United States is for consumption expenditures. Private investment expenditures were almost $2 trillion, Government purchases a little over $3 trillion, and net exports negative $562 billion. So when we add all this up, we get a very useful equation. When we talk about GDP, and we're often going to use the letter Y to represent GDP, we have GDP as consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports. When we add all that up, we get an equation where Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. This will be a very useful thing for you to remember as we move forward in this course.